Good afternoon, everybody. I am Nathaniel Jae, and this is Alive and Thriving. Thank you for joining me for yet again another installment of Life and Teaching of the Masters of the Far East. This is going to be Chapter 2 today, and without further ado, let's jump right into it. The next morning, we had our breakfast at the lodge, then went directly to the temple, then went directly to the upper room of the temple. There was no visible concept of the confines of a room, nor any evidence of limitation, and so we moved freely with no thought of exertion. When we were ready to go below to the room of the records, we were there. As we had accomplished this without the presence of our friends, we realized the reason for their withdrawal and were very much elated over our attainment. The 1st of April was fast approaching. We had finished the records in the temple rooms and had taken up the work of making measured drawings of the numerous characters and many carvings cut in the rocks outside. This work was going along very nicely because of our all-absorbing interest. One afternoon, a messenger came to the village, and as the villagers gathered around him, we saw that something unusual was happening. We dropped our work and proceeded to the village. We met our hostess and were informed that the messenger had brought the information that a party of bandits was at large in the valley below. This caused considerable uneasiness among the inhabitants, as this village had been the focal point of attempted raids for many years. The report had gone far and wide that the Tau-Cross Temple was the hiding place for a vast treasure. The many attempts to rob the village had failed. The bands had in a great measure attributed former failures to the resistance of the people who lived in the valley below. A number of the bands had now concentrated their combined forces, and a band of about 4,000 well-mounted and armed men were preying upon and devastating the valley in order to discourage the resistance of the inhabitants in closer proximity to the little village of the Tau-Cross. They hoped by this method that the raid would be more successful. The messenger also appealed for protection for the remaining inhabitants, as a great many had already been destroyed and they had reached the limit of their resistance. He was told that there was none in the village who could be sent, but our hostess assured him that he could return to his home and that no harm would come to his people. We went on with our work, noting the uneasiness of the villagers, and that uneasiness was communicated to us. The next morning, we again resumed our work as we were very anxious to complete the references for our records. We were certain they would give a complete and accurate history and also references as to where other records could be found. Thus, we could trace the history of this older and extremely enlightened civilization that occupied this vast and now most remote portion of the world. We were disturbed by the possibility of losing this collection by reason of the bandit raids. As the result of our work, this collection was all assembled in the rooms of the records, where they had hitherto withstood a number of similar raids from the same source. That evening, we talked to our hostess about the possibility of the formulation of some plan to aid the villagers and voiced our surprise and wonder at the absence of our friends. We were told that, as an appeal for aid had been made by the messenger, the bandits would be obliged to stop their raids or they would destroy themselves. We retired that evening fully assured that we had been over-solicitous of our own safety. We arose early and were preparing to resume work when the same messenger appeared with the news that the raids had ceased upon the inhabitants and that the band had concentrated their entire force about 20 miles down the valley for an apparent concerted last drive on our little village. As our hostess and little party stood talking to the messenger, who was surrounded by a group of the villagers, a horseman rode into the village and came toward us. In coming toward us, as he passed smaller groups of congregated people, he was apparently recognized. They immediately dispersed and fled in terror as he neared our group. The messenger called out the horseman's name, and then the messenger, as well as the others, took refuge in flight, evidently fearing that the horseman was being followed by the band. Our hostess and ourselves were the only ones left as we awaited the nearer approach of the horseman. He reined in his horse, and with much gusto addressed our chief, began to speak, saying that the bandits were fully aware we were strangers and that they were acquainted with our mission. He spoke in a tongue that none of us understood. He saw our bewilderment and asked if there were not someone that could interpret. Our hostess turned and faced the man as he sat upon his horse and asked if she could be of service. At first, he looked as though he had received a severe electric shock. He, however, sufficiently recovered his composure to fairly spring from his horse. He rushed toward her with outstretched hand, claiming, "You here?" in the language that we understood. Then he placed his hands to his forehead and prostrated himself before her, begging her pardon. Our hostess directed him to arise and deliver his message. He could see her form stiffen. We could see her form stiffen, and for a moment, her features almost blazed with anger. So intense was her display of emotion that for an instant, we, as well as the man himself, were absolutely startled out of our composure. The words, "Coward, murderer, step forth and deliver your message," almost leapt from her lips. The man again went to his knees. Again the words blazed forth, "Stand up! Are you so debased that you dare not stand?" We did not wonder at the man's abject terror, for we, as well as he, were absolutely rooted to the spot, unable to move. I am certain, had it been humanly possible for the man to have done so, he would have fled from the scene. For the moment he, as well as ourselves, had lost all power of speech and action, he crumbled to the ground, limp and apparently lifeless, his eyes staring and his mouth agape. This was the first and only time in our experience with these people of superior powers that we had seen one of them give expression in any way to violent emotion. We were as terrified as the bandit. The vibrations hit us just as distinctly as the force of a tremendous explosion, accompanied by an electric shock that not only paralyzed speech but our muscles as well. This is the only way I can describe the sensation. Coming from that slight and unassuming fragile form, do you wonder that these vibrations paralyzed us into inaction? Although this situation lasted only a moment, it seemed hours before the tension relaxed. We were as transfixed as statues, yet there flooded over us in that instant a great pity for the bandit, and we found ourselves longing to go to his assistance. This was the reaction of all, yet we only stood and stared at our hostess. Almost at once the condition changed. At first, a startled look came over her face, then it changed to the same kindly expression that we were accustomed to, and there swept over us such a wave of compassion that we rushed to the prostrate form on the ground. Our hostess was bending over him, her hand clasping his. Again, we were mystified and could only say, "Will wonders never cease?" The man soon regained consciousness, was helped to his feet, and was made as comfortable as possible on a bench nearby. He absolutely refused to enter any of the houses. Our hostess then apologized for the vehemence which she had expressed, noting the effect it had upon us. Our flesh was quivering, and it required some time for us to regain our composure. She explained that this man was the leader of one of the most notorious bands that infested that portion of the Gobi. His name, if mentioned at all, was spoken with awe, as he was the most fearless and ruthless of characters. His familiar title, literally translated, meant consummate black devil released from hell. His features portrayed in mask were kept in many villages and worn by those participating in the rituals of driving the evil spirit from the village and its inhabitants. Our hostess had contacted this man on 2 former occasions when attempted raids had failed, and each time he had evidenced the deepest hatred for her and our friends in general, going out of his way to harass them and sending violent messages from time to time, which they ignored completely. His sudden appearance alone had brought the past indignities so forcibly before her that she, for the time being, had lost control of her emotions. Having fully regained her composure, she walked over to the man. At her approach, he made a futile attempt to rise, but was only able to draw himself together and sit more erect. The picture of abject fear, hatred was delineated in every movement of his body, which was trembling and, though stricken with palsy. Our hostess, now cool and collected, with no trace of fear or emotion, her face, features, and body as wonderfully cut as the most delicate cameo, presented an amazing contrast. We wanted to remove the man at once, and although this thought was not expressed, our hostess raised her hand commanding silence. Our chief realized that she was in charge of the situation and that anything we would attempt to do would only place us in a ludicrous position. He withdrew out of hearing while our hostess talked in low and quiet tones for quite some time before the man answered a word. As he spoke, the lady motioned us to approach. We sat on the ground before them, glad to make any move that would relieve the tension of suspense. The bandit explained that he had prevailed upon his superior leaders to allow him to come as a peace emissary to treat with the people for the surrender of the supposed treasure that was concealed in the Tau Cross Temple. If the inhabitants would surrender the treasure, the bandits would agree not to molest them further. And would agree to release all their prisoners, of which they claimed there were over 3,000, and would immediately then leave the country and never again molest the inhabitants of the valley. Our hostess told him there was no treasure that would be of any value to them. A thorough explanation of the fact was gone into, with an offer to conduct him through all the rooms of the temple or any place he wished to go. He flatly refused this proposition, saying that he feared they would hold him as a hostage, and no assurance upon our part could break down this fear. Our hostess reassured him of our sincerity, and he suddenly became convinced that we were honest in our statements. Then a situation difficult and alarming for him arose. He told us that he was the instigator of this plot and had fired the imaginations of the other bandits with the zeal for possessing the treasure, and that he painted a lurid picture of the fabulous wealth that would be theirs should he succeed. In fact, he and his father had held their band together with promises of the possession of this treasure. He was the chief of the band that had consolidated with 5 other bands to carry out this raid. The crux of this situation was that if he should return to his band with the information that there was no treasure, he would immediately be branded as a traitor and as such would be dealt with accordingly. He could not deter the band from the contemplated attack, as they would not believe him on account of his zeal in pressing the situation up to this point. It was decidedly an embarrassing position for him. To our great surprise, our hostess offered to accompany him to the camp. Our protests were quietly overruled, and she prepared to leave immediately. She assured us then that she was in no danger, but that if we went along, our presence would instill suspicion in the minds of the bandits, so that all would incur great danger. We meekly submitted. There was nothing else that we could do. The man mounted his horse, and we assisted her to mount to the seat that was prepared behind him. As they rode from the village, they presented a never-to-be-forgotten picture, one that will live in our memories for all eternity. The bandit, with doubt written all over his feature, and our hostess smiling back at us with the warm assurance that she would return by nightfall. We lost all interest in our work for the rest of the day, and we wandered aimlessly about the village until sunset. We returned to the lodge then to await the return of our hostess, and upon entering, we found the table loaded with good things to eat. You can imagine our astonishment to see her seated at the head of the table and greeting us with that radiant smile of hers. We were speechless. Words failed us entirely. She assumed an air of mock hauteur and tried to say sternly, "Gentlemen, a greeting is in order." Whereupon we bowed and extended our salutations. Then she continued, "I failed utterly to convince them, but they did not agree to give me an answer within the next 3 days. But they did agree to give me an answer within the next 3 days. I know that the answer will be an attempted attack, but I did save the life of that poor creature for the time being, at least. We shall be obliged to prepare ourselves to withstand the siege. Nothing will deter them from making the attempt. I think that nearly all of us saw our fondest dreams and the results go a-glimmering, as the familiar saying has it. Our hostess read our innermost thoughts and repeated this poem. When you come to the Red Sea, place in your life, when in spite of all you can do, there is no way round, there is no way back, there is no other way but through. Then know God with a soul serene, and the dark and the storm are gone. God stills the wind. God stills the waves. Go on to your soul. Go on, go on, go on. Thus ends the reading of Chapter 2 from Book 3 of Life and Teaching of the Masters of the Far East. Thank you much for being here today. And if you liked today's video, please subscribe, leave a comment below, let me know your thoughts. I look forward to hearing from you, and I look forward to making another video for you tomorrow. Namaste.